Hey folks, welcome back to Nodevember day 8, although not really day 8 anymore, just prompt 8 is Bejewelled. And for this one I decided to push the boat out a little bit and do some ceremonial plate armor. If you're interested in this, this was not really worn in battle, it was more for ceremonial purposes and just for showing off your wealth. It's pretty simple actually. I use basically the same sort of 4 or 5 workflows throughout the whole process. I am going to make a proper tutorial on how to create this bi-rail loft tool. If you're from a CAD background, then you'll probably be familiar with bi-rail lofting. It's essentially creating NURBS patches from several splines. Essentially you have a rail, 2 rails, one on each side, so bi-rail, and then you have a profile, and rather than just sweeping one profile along one rail as we would normally do with the curve to mesh node, in this case what we do is if you imagine you've got 2 rails and you put your profile one end on one rail, one end on the other rail, and then you slide it along those 2 rails and it gets bigger and smaller depending on the distance between the rails. That is the process that we're going through here. And just to add a bit more complexity, I've also made it so that I can have multiple different profiles and it will interpolate between them across the loft. So for example, this breastplate, I have different profiles depending on whether we're going over the chest piece or around the stomach. And then for the neck as well, I just did the same thing, just with a circle, 2 circles as my rails, and one of them I sort of slumped over the shoulders, offsetting in the Z-axis. It's all pretty basic. There's just a lot of layers of basic, and eventually you end up with something pretty complicated at the end. Also, when doing something like this, I recommend you just use a human base model. I just used like an architectural figure here, but just any sort of standard model to get the right sizes and proportions and things is always very useful. The most complicated part of the base mesh for all of this was definitely the shoulder pieces. There's just so much going on in terms of the curvature, and I tried 3 or 4 different ways to do it. I cut out all of the failed attempts, but in the end, what I went with was an arc that wrapped from the tip of the shoulder around onto the front, and then I swept another arc along that, and instanced half a circle curve at the end of that, and stretched the final vertices of my loft over to that circle, which is why you can see those faces on the end of that shoulder piece coming across the chest. They're a little bit longer. Then I could take this whole section, mirror it onto the back, extrude a band all the way around to give me something that I was going to give decoration to later, and then set up a repeat zone to give me a multi-extrude down the arm. And yeah, just quite a complicated shape, but once you break it down into the individual moves that you need to make, it's not that difficult really. Adding a little bit of complexity in a pretty arbitrary way by just taking off a few panels and lifting them out and pulling them outwards, just to make it look a bit more interesting. It is the standard spaceship approach to doing things. You know, you just, on a lot of like sci-fi art, people just make random panels and pull them out, and it just makes it look extra detailed. All of the panels, and I did this for all of the armor elements, I put a bit of piping around. So I just extracted the edge boundary and did a curve to mesh with a curved circle. And then wherever it felt like it made sense, I also took the boundary loop, moved it inwards by the cross product of the curved tangent and the nearest surface normal. And that lets you sort of slide sideways on the surface. And then I resampled and instanced little icospheres to pretend to be rivets. Just alludes a little bit to this being something that somebody made at some point. It wanted to feel crafted. So you can see I've just thrown on a bunch of basic placeholder materials, and I've set up my node graph so that I now have each of these sections. So I have arms, shoulders, chest, neck, and later I will also add waist. Each of these is in its own node group. and then these all join afterwards, and I apply materials to them outside the node group, just so it's easier for me to switch things around later. The way that I assigned each mesh to have its materials was just through a store named attribute, and I would store something like gold or fabric or whatever it might be as just a boolean, and then I would use that as a mask later to apply the correct material. So I'm starting to get into creating some of the decorations here, and what I basically have done is just create a curl noise, so a repeat zone where I extrude a vertex out into an edge string and perturb it through a noise field. So basically the offset of that extrude is just a noise texture, and so rather than it being displaced and bent and warped, because it's extruding through that noise field, it creates a much more curly look, hence the name curl noise. I've just done this with a slight offset for each of my points, which gives me these sorts of fanned, brushed out looking things. And then I've added symmetry, so I've just reflected them to one another, and then I've instanced them along curves. And what I've done in this case is, rather than just instancing it on the curve, I've actually instanced a straight line of them, and then I have deformed that straight line to a curve. So you can create your curve deform where you sample the curve position, and then you're also going to be sampling the curve normal and tangent, and between the normal to tangent, and you can create the binormal, which is your third axis of the curve space, just by using the cross product of the tangent and the normal. You can then add those together. I have a tutorial on this, so if you're interested, go check that out. But it allows you basically to take curves and bend things along them. It's very useful. And for a lot of the extra sections, so I was taking edge banding, and then I was just growing with curl noise. So I'd instance a bunch of points, or distribute loads of points on that surface, and then I would just extrude them through noise field, and it just gives this sort of very easy, I'm not going to say cheap because it's extremely expensive computationally. The amount that I'm doing this is very slow. And there's a lot of times where I have repeat zones inside repeat zones because optimization was not something that I was considering. I was just trying to be fast and sketchy and just have fun with it. What you can see now is me making these brooches, basically the same process all over again. So I've got an icosphere, which you can dual mesh if you want to have hexagons instead of triangles. I've put that inside a circle, which I've created a random profile for by taking points, randomly positioned, and then do a points to curves node. That becomes my profile. I can then mess around with that with a random seed. And then I'm doing the same thing again that I did before with the curl noise, where I create a bunch of points, and each one has a very slightly different noise seed, and it creates this sort of splay, kind of like a spread of leaves. And it looks random, it doesn't look very interesting, but as soon as you put the curve to mesh with the float curve to make it bulge at the end so it looks more like a leaf, that's one step better. And then you give it symmetry, that suddenly looks a lot more intentional. And then we're also doing rotational arrays around the brooches, and suddenly it just looks really decorative, and it's a very easy thing to set up, but very effective for especially this kind of modeling. How did I get those 3 brooches onto the shoulder piece? For that, I used mesh wrapping, where you sample the UV map from the shoulder piece, and I am using just the bounding box. So I'm taking the position of my brooches all together, put them through a bounding box, taking the position vector through a map range with those bounding box min and max values, outputting 0 to 1. So that now gives me a normalized XYZ across my 3 brooches together. And then using that to sample the UV map from the shoulder to tell me what the positions should be. And then I'm sticking them into those positions. And then to inflate them back into being a 3-dimensional form, I am also sampling the normal of the shoulder position, so that I know the direction to extrude these back out into. And I'm scaling that by the original Z height of my brooches, and then I'm just adding that so it becomes an offset in the normal direction. So with all that done, did a little bit of material work there. I'm adding this mesh blocker inside the mesh to create sort of volume for shoulders, just so that the camera doesn't see through into the geometry. and I've just used a couple of circles and then, a couple of spheres, mesh to SDF, joined those SDFs within SDF Boolean, and then used an SDF fillet to round out the join. Set my resolution how I wanted it, and then just on all of those points, I instanced an iGoSphere and rotated it slightly so that it looks potentially like chainmail. Don't get too close to it, it's not perfect, but for just something to fill in space and give a little bit of visual noise, it works quite well. I came back and I tweaked the curves that were on that top chest section just to allow me to actually pull in a waist bit, because I'd made the top a little bit too long, and obviously it's all procedural, so everything still works and still follows. All of my detailing that I've done so far is still intact, and it just allowed me to then create a new section for this waist skirt which comes down below. And again, just doing the same kind of thing, so taking the top section of the geometry, giving it the gold boolean so that it auto assigns the gold material, taking a few of those edges and giving them the curve to mesh with the piping to make it look like it has that gold bead around, and then also just instancing a bunch of the gems on it just to make it look a bit more ornamental. I wanted to give it a little bit more visual interest, so I've also added this sort of decorative rope, I guess, and this is just extracting a couple of circles from the geometry, rotating them a little bit and tweaking them based on the spline factor, just so I can move the one that overlaps forwards a little bit to give it a little bit of a kink as it crosses the other rope. Just, it's one thing that you will always notice in CG renders when people don't make ropes look like they're actually in tension. The knot is really simple, it's just two toruses slightly offset from one another, and then the tails coming down from that knot are just Bezier segments. To create the actual rope twist, all you do is you take, if you want a 3-core rope, just take 3 curved circles in a like a triangle pattern, and then use that as your profile curve when you do your curve to mesh, and then you just have to set your curve tilt based on the spline length, and then you just multiply that by some amount. Higher the amount you multiply by, the more twisted the rope becomes. Next thing I wanted to do was add more greeble to the surface, make it look like it had more sort of leaf motifs on the surface, and so I simply modified my gem in holder thing that makes the brooches. That's my node group for that. I let it pass out these sort of grown out wing shapes, these leaf motifs directly, and then I can just use that without any of the brooch logic to add greeble. So I was just extracting an edge boundary from the chest piece and instancing these leaf motifs on the ear. Now, technically, I'm sure people will be happy to say this to me, but the neck piece, as I've designed it here, should not be, I suppose, shouldn't really be separate from the chest piece, but at the very least, it should be underneath the chest piece. I was having a little bit of difficulty massaging it into the right position, so I just left it on top, and I knew that I was going to be able to cover all of the gaps with my greeble. So again, just doing the same kind of thing. I've got an extracted curve from the edge, which I've done my swirly gold stuff onto, where it's bending to the curve. I've then done another one where I'm instancing a bunch of these different brooches on here. And my process for doing this, because I made the brooches as like a one-off thing rather than it being designed to be repeatable. And so that limited what I was able to do in terms of creating a system where I was generating a lot of them automatically. As a result, what I did was I just took a curve, did curve to points, so that I have a bunch of points, passed that into a for each element node, and then I was able to operate on each of these points individually. So I could generate one brooch, set its position to be this curve position, and randomize the like all of the inputs, basically all of the seeds and things. And that, not in a very performant way, because obviously there's repeat zones inside these as well, growing out the edges of the brooches, but that allowed me to create a whole bunch of varied ones all at the same time without any manual work. So that's what's going up the front of the chest piece, and it's what's going around the collar as well, where the chest and the neck piece connect. What you can see me doing now is adding some additional details. So I wanted to have some like medieval ceremonial necklaces hanging over. So this would be something that maybe like the High Sheriff or a king or a duke or something would wear during ceremonial stuff. So I wanted to add one which was sort of made of these coin plate chain link things, which had a large brooch on the end. And this is all really basic, simple modeling. I'm just taking like cylinders and icospheres and just mashing them together basically. But you add enough of these layers and you can suddenly sketch out something quite nice. I suppose the complexity and the challenge is adding the float curves based on the spline factor and the position to push that necklace in 3D space. I'm essentially just doing like proportional editing. So I'm not moving individual vertices, I'm just grabbing sections and shifting it based on the float curve. And that lets me pull things up so that they're going over the decorations, drop things down vertically, and just generally have a lot more ability to like, it's essentially sculpting at this point. So very nice and easy. And then I did the same thing. So I just duplicated all my logic, rotated it around, made some minor tweaks. And then rather than using the circle plates, I used a chain link made of a quadrilateral that I'd filleted the corners of. The next thing to do was I wanted a proper collar. So I'd made like a little placeholder blocker thing before, but I wanted one that was a proper like gambeson, which is it's like a padded material with quilting, basically fits underneath your armor. So I created this flat just like as a pattern. So I created like a grid, poked the faces with like an extrude faces with 0 offset, and then scale them down to 0, merged by distance. This gives me my cross pattern. And then I did a manifold mesh boolean to join it, to cut it to the shape that I wanted with the rounded corners. And then just like how I'd done the shoulders, I then wrapped this onto that curved mesh that I'd previously made for the neck piece. So that collar piece, has its own UVs. So I just sampled those to give me the position and the normal that I needed to rebuild my gambeson into the correct position. Final few steps here, I just wanted to make one sort of hero brooch to go on the chest piece. And this time I manually made myself a little nice shaped gemstone, and then added a bunch of these wings around it from my gem in holder group that I'd made previously. And it's all just the same stuff, just instancing it, just giving it symmetry, giving it rotational symmetry, and then instancing a bunch more gems around it. And yeah, nice and easy, reusing the logic from all over the place. So this is taking the gems from around the waist and then dropping them around the collar, grabbing the center spline from the collar piece and then adding a bit more complexity with a few more brooches and a little bit of cleanup just at the end. So any of that little gold overlap stuff that I had, just booleaned it out with a sphere. I know that was a really quick overview of this model, especially considering the complexity. It took me around about 12 to 15 hours of actual work that I spent on it. It is a big file. I do not necessarily encourage you to work the way that I worked on this. It was very much a sketch. But if you are interested in having a play, having it explore, do check the links down in the description. The file is freely available if you want to play with it. The bi-rail loft, I will do a tutorial on how to make that node group because it's super useful. And beyond that, we're really just bending stuff to curves and bending stuff to surfaces and then just generally instancing stuff. All right, there we go. Hope this has been fun. Hope you learned something, and I'll catch you in the next one.